I just want to get back to something you mentioned earlier. You said that the U.S. intelligence sees the drones which entered Polish airspace as being a European/Ukrainian hoax to pull America into this conflict. Have you gotten any feedback on how U.S. intelligence assess the accusation that three Russian jets entered Estonian airspace? Because, well, this is something that the Russians are denying. Of course, we shouldn't take it all at face value, but it does seem very strange because a few days earlier, well, not few days, but at the end of August, we saw a Reuters report saying that the Americans had told the Europeans that they would be reducing their military presence in the Baltics, which is something that the Russians would welcome. And seemingly the only thing that would prevent this would be if Russians would step up their aggressions, and suddenly jets appear over Estonian airspace. I'm not saying that that it necessarily is a Estonian hoax, but it sure doesn't look like this is in Russian interest to have this happen at this point in time.
Well, you're right. It didn't happen. It's a lie.
Is that verified or?
Well, that's what I'm told.
Yeah.
My sources have been very straightforward about that. They did not deliberately enter Estonian airspace. Again, you can fly along the air defense identification zone. But as you point out, you always have to ask the question, qui bono, who benefits? Is there any benefit to the Russians to stop the alliance from self-destruction? None. Let them self-destruct. But the Estonians, the Baltic littoral has always been a problem. When Germany was finally unified into one state by 1879, there was a huge lobby in Berlin arguing that the German army had to be marched east to, quote-unquote, liberate the Baltic states from the Tsar. I mean, it was a very serious moment. The King of Prussia, who was then the Emperor of Germany, summoned Bismarck and said, I don't want to go to war with the Tsar. The Tsar's my friend. Russia is our ally. And he said, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. Ultimately, he brought in von Moltke, the great chief of the new German general staff, and they both gave presentations to the Reichstag. And these speeches were very good. And Moltke said, look, first of all, the people in the Baltic are not being abused by the Russians. The Tsar has been very, very tolerant and indulgent. And that was true for the time Peter the Great took over because he wanted to tax the commerce. And the Baltic states were very successful. He left the German aristocracy that ran the Baltic states in place. They became part of the Tsarist table of ranks. I mean, what I'm trying to tell you is they knew what was real and what was not. And they said, we can help ameliorate conditions. And things can be improved in certain areas, but that happens through our friendship with Russia quietly behind the scenes. So a war in 1879 between Germany and Russia was averted. And the old Kaiser went and met Tsar Alexander II at the border. They embraced, and that was the end of it. And you know, the various newspapers who were printing all of this inflammatory nonsense, both in Moscow and Berlin, were basically told to stop. So, you know, by the time you get to 1914, democratization has taken over, and it becomes harder to stop these things. The monarchs no longer have the power they did 50 years earlier. But my point is, we got to take these people in the Baltic. They're nice people. I think the world of them. I've worked with them, and say, look, you know, it's time to stop the nonsense. You've got to get along with your neighbors. That doesn't mean that you roll over and play dead. No one's asking you to do that. But don't unnecessarily provoke the Russians. And the other point was militarily, very difficult to take and hold the Baltic littoral. Because you have Russia right next to you that has a vast front. You, on the other hand, have to move along through what used to be West and East Prussia up through Lithuania in order to hold the place. It's not easy. Militarily, it's a very difficult proposition. No one wants to say that, but that's true. You got to get along with your neighbor. We need to tell the Poles the same thing. When Poland was admitted to NATO, a lot of people in SHAPE headquarters where I worked liked the Poles very much, but we were concerned because of this unrelenting hostility toward Russia. Said, are we inviting someone into the alliance who could become a catalyst for war with Russia? And at the time, in 1998, 99, and 2000, nobody wanted to go to war with Russia. Nobody saw Russia as a danger. Everybody wanted better relations with Russia at that point. So I just think we have to take whatever is reported with a grain of salt. Now, we supposedly had 3 drones flown over Copenhagen Airport or in the vicinity of it. Again, we have no evidence that those 3 drones, whatever they were, came from Russia. None. We don't know where they came from. We don't know who did it. I'm very skeptical of all of these attempts to characterize these as Russian provocations for the very reason that you cite. It's very obvious that we Americans are not going to put troops on the ground in Ukraine. We're not going to join this war as a direct belligerent. Unfortunately, we refuse to just stand up with some measure of character and say this must stop. I, President Trump, with my allies, we will sit down, we will put together a serious counterproposal. Once we have reviewed all of the Russian security arrangements that were proposed back in December 21. We've never done that. We have never listened to the Russians. That's the biggest problem. That was President Putin's message to Ambassador McFaul when he came in. After he listened to the usual rhetoric from McFaul, he walked over and he said, the problem with you is you do not listen. We're still not listening. So instead of listening, we're maintaining the fiction that something good has happened, because how much money have we wasted on this prospect, this silly nonsense in Ukraine? How many people have lost their lives because of Washington's war with Russia? Because that's what it is. And all of the Europeans have stupidly marched down into hell with us. They've deindustrialized themselves. They've gutted their economies. They're in bad shape as a result. Instead of just stepping forward and saying, I'm President Trump, I'm the leader of NATO, I want to end this war. We're going to put proposals together. I will meet with Mr. Putin. After we have studied all of his proposals, we'll give him some counter proposals. But throw this nonsense fantasy out of the 3rd floor or 3rd story building window of reclaiming the Russian-speaking portions of Ukraine or anything else from the Russians on the battlefield. That's not going to happen.
Well, what you're saying is, well, it makes common sense. My concern is that common sense hasn't really prevailed a lot over the past few years now. I mean, we're in the situation that is NATO, where we have run out of money, we've run out of weapons, we've been running out of Ukrainian soldiers, and now we see that the Americans are effectively announcing a bit covertly that they're pulling out, that this will have to be Europe's responsibility and Europe's mess. And, every day the deal will get worse. We'll see more territorial losses. The best thing we seem to be hoping for is that we can make Ukraine lose slower, but then, of course, losing more men, which risks the entire nation dying off as they can't recover. I guess I would like to see Trump be more honest than doing this clever little scheme where he throws out some big statements while he does this. But I guess my concern is, if it was common sense, the Europeans would do as they would have done in the 19th century, sit down, come up with an agreement which is mutual beneficial instead of continuing this self-harm and the destruction of Ukraine. But there's a panic in Europe which is breeding a lot of stupidity. How are you explaining the fact that Europeans are still pushing forward, holding on to these claims by Trump that we can still win and, Russia is hopeless and losing?
I think Donald Trump is one of these people that, having said something or promised something, cannot find it in himself to say, I was wrong. There has to be a different way forward. He can't do that. I don't think his donors will let him do that, because his donors want him to back Israel in its war with Iran and everybody else in the region. They want him to stay engaged in Ukraine and fight Russia. In the meantime, he's preparing to begin a new conflict in Venezuela. And that Europeans ought to take a look at that, because that's very real now. I don't know when it'll happen, but there are very foolish people in Washington who've convinced themselves that Venezuela is a pushover, that it's effectively like Panama and Noriega when we went into Panama a long time ago. It's not. It's very different. But this is unfortunately an American tactic. Instead of coming to terms with the reality of the mistake that was made, ensuring you don't repeat it, you go off and make another mistake in another place and change the subject. From the very beginning, Europeans asked me, if you're right and the Russians win, this is 3 years ago, win this war and the NATO alliance effectively crumbles, which I predicted in January of 2022, then what do you think the Americans will do? And I said they'll do what they did after Vietnam, change the subject. All the news media will stop talking about it. And they're going to begin talking about Venezuela. And they're going to trump up these ridiculous charges that Venezuela is a kingpin in the drug trafficking business, which it's not. And why we need to go there because it's so strategically important. Then they'll start talking about oil and gas and all this other business. But, you would think we would have learned a long time ago that you can get oil and gas out of the ground without parking a tank on top of it. That was the lesson of the Middle East. And you started this by talking about pulling forces out of Iraq. Well, Iraq today is a de facto ally of Iran. And when we went into Iraq in 2003, one of the points that was made is whatever you do, don't occupy the place. Don't tear it down, because all you'll do is open up the opportunity for Iran and Iranian influence to pour into Iraq. Well, what did we do? And have we learned anything from that? I recently saw some film footage of Petraeus, the former four-star and CIA director, sitting next to Jolani, the former ISIS al-Qaeda killer who is now running at least part of Syria. And he's telling him, we're your friend. We're allied with you. Really? I mean, to me, that's incomprehensible. If he'd shown up and put a bullet in the man, I would have understood that. But suddenly he's our friend? What are we dealing with? You talk about rationality. There is none. Most important, there is no coherence. There is no coherent strategy. There is no consistency. It's Donald Trump's impulses. I've had enough of this. I couldn't make peace. I'm not going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, so the Europeans have it now. But what is this? The high school? The 11th grade? I didn't make the team, so the hell with the team. The United States is in a lot of trouble. Our government is a mess. Everything is determined by donors and what the donors want. No one is thinking in strategic terms about anything. No one is thinking about where we want to be in 5 to 10 years. They're not even thinking beyond Christmas.